Shalom and welcome to today's Middle East Report. In this programme today we'll be discussing the significance of Jerusalem and the battle over that eternal city, especially the Temple Mount. Warm welcome to the programme, and I have two special guests on the programme today. That is David Hoffbrand, who's an author, and also Robin Benson on the programme. So, gentlemen, welcome to the programme.
Thank you.
Thank you, Simon.
I'll start off with you, David. Now, you've got a very interesting and kind of very fascinating testimony. You're an author, you're also a musician, but how did you come to faith in Yeshua HaMashiach?
Well, I grew up in a very traditional Jewish family. Not Orthodox, but, you know, going to synagogue, having my bar mitzvah, but I never felt like I had a real connection with God. I didn't feel like I had an intimate relationship with God. And so I went on a quest, really, when I was about 13, 14, and I looked everywhere. I looked in the New Age, I looked, you know, wherever I could find. I just wanted to know the truth. And it was as though when I gave up looking, because I didn't find what I was looking for, but when I gave up looking, it was as though God came looking for me. And of course, as a good Jewish boy, the last thing that I wanted to be was a Christian. I felt like that was betraying everything, you know, of my roots and so on. But over a number of years, I had a series of encounters with God, supernatural encounters, that began to convince me that Jesus is who he said he is. And much to my dismay at the time, and ultimately, of course, for my blessing, I found faith not just in God, but also in Yeshua, in Jesus, and found that I could have a relationship with God through that. So it took a number of years. It was a bit of a journey, but it was a very supernatural journey. And I think I needed that, as a lot of Jewish people do, because there are so many barriers, I think, over centuries of what's happened with the Jewish people that stop us from recognizing Jesus as the Jewish Messiah.
Excellent. And David has written a book, and it's entitled The Jewish Jesus. So if you want to know more about his incredible story, there's his book. And Robin, it's always good to have you back on the Middle East Report. Now, you've spent nearly 2 years in Jerusalem. So what does Jerusalem mean to you?
Jerusalem is such a city of contrasts. You have the old city with all of the archaeology, all of the biblical history associated with it. And of course, you've got the new developing city that's expanding, particularly over on the western side. But for me, as a Bible-believing Christian, it's the heart of what my faith is all about. It's where Yeshua, where Jesus went on a regular basis up to the feasts. And of course, it's where he gave his life and rose from the dead. So it's the center of everything that motivates me as a human being since I came to know him in my late teens.
Excellent. And, same to you, David. What does Jerusalem mean to you as a Jewish believer?
It's a good question. I think what you find in the Bible is that God narrows his focus down. You know, so he's of course, all the people belong to him, and all of the peoples of the world, they're God's. But yet he talks about the Jewish people as my people. And in the same way, we have this with the land. You know, the whole earth belongs to the Lord, but then he talks about Israel as my land. And then he narrows it down even more. So when we come to Jerusalem, he says about my city, my holy mountain. And I think what Jerusalem is for Jewish people, it's that focus. It's that focal point. And so for me, there's the, you know, as Robin was saying, there's that kind of great vibrancy of the city itself. But alongside that, there's this sense that throughout the centuries, it's been the focus for Jewish people. Next year in Jerusalem, next year in Jerusalem, every Passover, you know. So it's got emotional significance and spiritual significance, I would say. And it really does feel like home.
Absolutely.
And I think for me, there's a phrase that occurs several times in the Psalms, the city of the great king, and that's an expression that has come to mean more and more to me over the years as I've sort of thought about what that implies, not just for now, but for the future.
Absolutely. You know, and both of you, I mean, my first experience of seeing Jerusalem was a young 21-year-old. Got off the plane from Ben Gurion Airport, took a cheroot up to Jerusalem. And then when you come into the top of Jerusalem and you see the old city, it's so majestic and so awe-inspiring that once you go to Jerusalem, it always captivates your heart. Let's have a look now at a very brief history of that eternal city known as Jerusalem. There you go, a very short history of that wonderful, magnificent city known as Jerusalem. I mean, Robin, when we refer to Jerusalem, I mean, it is mentioned, I think, around 667 times. Don't quote me on that for absolute sure, but somewhere around there in the Bible. So we know that this is God's city. It's very precious to him. And isn't it incredible that here we are in 2018 and it's like we're living in biblical times, because it's only really been that generation in 1948 that saw Jerusalem become the capital of the new modern state of Israel. How significant do you think these times are?
Oh, 1948 was a game changer as far as modern history is concerned, because you had the reconstitution. It's not the creation of the State of Israel, it's the reconstitution of the State of Israel following on from the post-World War I, peace negotiations and all those details. And it's like God's prophecy clock started moving forward again after, well, the Jewish people had been out of the land for 2,000 years in exile. Now, they had been returning in dribs and drabs in, decades before that. But this was Israel back on the world stage once again. Surviving through the War of Independence, miraculously, there's no other word for it. And then all the other conflicts that have happened since. But it's always been centered on Jerusalem because it is the focus of the Jewish people. Wherever they are in the world, Jerusalem is the focus of their attention. And so Jerusalem then was back on the world stage once again. And that has not changed in the last 70 years. I mean, there's hardly a week goes by, but there isn't something happening that brings Jerusalem back onto the news scene once more. So, and all of that does is fulfill biblical prophecy. The words that God gave through the Old Testament prophets, and even some of the things that the Lord Jesus confirmed in his ministry, that this would be the case, that Jerusalem would be a stumbling block, a stone of offense for the nations as they try to usurp their control over the city that actually belongs to God in the first place.
And David, in terms of biblical prophecy, we are really seeing the fulfillment of God's word in our day, aren't we, with the re-establishment of Jerusalem as the capital of a Jewish state?
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, just as Robin was saying, you know, Jesus said, Jerusalem will be trampled until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. And talking about the fullness, the fullness Paul talks about of the Gentiles coming in. And so there's always an until. Just as Robin was saying, you know, they've got this huge gap, centuries and centuries, but yet there is an until always with the Jewish people and with Jerusalem and with Israel, and we're in the until is coming to pass, and it's amazing because I think sometimes we can look at that and just think, well, it's politics, it's this or that, as though God can't move through people, can't move through politics, but in reality, God always moves through kings. He moves through people. And governments, he moves through what goes on in the world. It's not something abstract and spiritual, but it's much more practical. So it is incredible to see what's going on and to try and discern what God is really doing at every point.
Yeah. And Robin, when we think of Jerusalem, you know, we really think that this is the eternal capital, not only of the Jewish people, but the future millennial kingdom. In terms of Jerusalem in biblical prophecy, what do you think has to be fulfilled so far? Obviously, there is the rebuilding of the third temple.
Well, there's the rebuilding of the third temple. There are the indications in some of the what we call the minor prophets of another conflict at which Jerusalem will form a center point. We haven't really seen that. It was to a certain extent in the War of Independence, but not in the way that the scriptures portray it, with all nations coming against Israel and against Jerusalem. So these are the sorts of things to be watching for. But also, I mean, it's not a case of what is to come. It's actually, we base the understanding of what is to come on what has already happened. And the prophecy that talks about old men and children playing in the streets of Jerusalem, we've seen that since 1948 with that the sort of gap, and then from 67 onwards, and just again the re-establishment of Jerusalem as the center, the governmental center, the social center, the cultural center of the Jewish people and all those who attach themselves to that in some form or other.
Yeah. David, what does it mean for Israel, what does it mean for world Jewry to know that Jerusalem is back in the hands of the Jewish people, particularly as we remember approaching the 51st anniversary of the liberation and unification of Jerusalem after the Six-Day War in June 67?
I think, look, what's interesting and what you see is that although people think of Israel as this conquering, nation in some respects, that's how the media portrays them. In reality, Israel has grown through being attacked. Each time it seems as though Israel's going to be destroyed, it's led to it actually expanding slightly and still being on a war footing with most of the nations around it. And that's what happened with Jerusalem. Israel, in a sense, didn't actually go out to, like, we're going to go and conquer Jerusalem. It was defending itself in a war and took that ground. And so we see that God is moving through all of these things in incredible ways, because where nobody thought that Israel would even exist anymore, somehow that happens. And so for Jewish people, I think what they see and what we see is God's hand in bringing these things to pass. And that hatred of the Jewish people, which just seems irrational and to be sustained beyond all reason, and that what you see throughout the Bible, you see again in modern day events, which is, it always starts with a bit of persecution, but it always seems to end with, no, it's not enough, we have to destroy them. And so Israel has been fighting for its life, but instead of getting smaller, it's got bigger. And so in all of that, what you see for Jewish people is that Jerusalem has become its capital again in the midst of all of those struggles, in the midst of that persecution. And so it feels like God has a hand in all of this.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and if you look at, I'm just thinking, as you were speaking, thinking of the maps that exist outlining what was to be the British Mandate territory. Okay, 77% of that was hived off and given to Jordan. But what Israel regained after the 67 Six-Day War in particular actually returned the situation to what they should have had right from the beginning of the mandate. So it was like, pardon the expression, God thumbing his nose at the United Nations and saying, well, this is what you said you were going to give them. Then you weren't going to give it to them, and now I've given it back to them, and they've got it. And they're not going to let go of it. You know, whatever pressure the world tries to bring upon them, it's theirs. And it's theirs by right, both internationally, legally, but biblically. And we have to hold those two things in tension, because that's the reality. And sadly, what's happening today is that there's so much determined effort on the part of most of the rest of the world to undermine the Jewish people's right to their existence as a very state, constantly calling it into question. And of course that affects Jerusalem too.
Absolutely. So let's have a look now at Danny Alon, Israel's former Deputy Foreign Minister, talking about the truth of Jerusalem.
Some claim that Jerusalem is an occupied city. They admit that once upon a time it was the capital city of the Jewish people. But they argue it lost the title some 2,000 years ago, after it was destroyed and its Jewish inhabitants were exiled. And they say, in 1967, the Jews showed up and took Jerusalem from the Palestinian people. So in that case, why does President Donald Trump want to move the US Embassy to Jerusalem? Here is the truth about Jerusalem and the Jewish people. Jerusalem was the capital of the Jewish kingdom established by King David 3,000 years ago. His son, King Solomon, built the first temple in the place where, according to tradition, the binding of Isaac and Abraham took place 1,000 years earlier. The Babylonians destroyed the temple and exiled the Jews, but the Jews quickly returned. 500 years later, the Romans destroyed the second temple. But did that end the Jews' connection to Jerusalem? The answer is a resounding no. In the 2,000 years that followed, empires came and left, conquered, colonized, and occupied Jerusalem, never turning it into their capital, while the Jews, Jerusalem's indigenous people, continued living in and returning to Jerusalem despite the hardship and danger involved. Over 1,000 years ago, the Arab writer Muqaddasi complained that the Jews constitute the majority of Jerusalem's population. Jews remained a majority also in modern times, as documented by the British Council in 1864. And Jerusalem was always the center of Jewish life, even for those living far away in the four corners of the earth. Special fast days and rituals mourn the destruction of the city, and daily prayers express the hope of a full return. In Islam, a religion which was established only 1,400 years ago, Jerusalem was never as holy as Mecca or Medina. In fact, Jerusalem isn't even mentioned in the Quran. Compare that to the 669 times Jerusalem is mentioned in the Hebrew Bible. Even Muslims on the Temple Mount turn their backs on Jerusalem and face Mecca when they pray. Whether in America, Russia, Iraq, or Iran, the direction of prayer for Jews has always been Jerusalem, the uniting force and the heart and soul of the Jewish people. So what really happened in 1967? First of all, there was no Palestinian entity. In 1948, Jordan conquered the eastern part of Jerusalem, dividing the city and expelling the Jews, destroying their homes, synagogues, and cemeteries. Western Jerusalem was re-established as Israel's capital, while Jordan's capital remained Amman. Then, in 1967, in a war of self-defense, the Jewish state liberated and united its historic capital city. What has happened since then? Israel has returned Jerusalem into a vibrant city and a house of all nations, establishing the freedom of worship to all peoples and religions. So why does President Trump want to move the embassy to Jerusalem? The real question is, why did it take so long?
That was great. Set the record straight about Jerusalem. David, I like what you said earlier, particularly about how God has a special people and a very special land and a special city. And then if we narrow that down even more, it's the Temple Mount. So how significant really is the Temple Mount? Because this is considered where the Holy of Holies lies, where the Dome of the Rock is now, but also has been the site of the first and second temples, but also it also represents almost God's seat of government on the earth.
Well, it represents authority as well, because it's the holiest place. So when Jews are praying to Jerusalem, in a sense, they're actually praying to the Temple Mount in a way, because they're facing in the direction that God and earth meet. So I think that's the significance, really. And it's significant, isn't it, that we've got the Wailing Wall, and it's really just a supporting wall, and yet it's such an emotional place for Jewish people, because it's the closest they can come to that temple that was where God met his people. So I think it's always going to be something that is deep in the hearts of Jewish people.
Absolutely. And Robin, the whole area of the Temple Mount, the Dome of the Rock, the Alaska compound is really at the heart of the conflict between Israel and the Muslim worlds, and also for the future of Western civilization. Why is there such a battle over the Temple Mount?
Well, you have to understand the Islamic mindset in that once they have conquered a piece of territory, in their worldview, it's theirs eternally. So if someone takes it away from them, then it is beholden upon them to get it back and keep control of it. So for right or for wrong, at the end of the Six-Day War, Israel returned the control of the Temple Mount to Jordan and the Arabs, and they've allowed that to perpetuate over the decades. And so you have a tussle for control over that plot of land. You have two world religions that claim it as a holy site, although Islam's claims are dubious at best. For the Jewish people, as David says, it is the focal point of their worship. And so whoever controls that in the end, it's almost like a game of one-upmanship on a spiritual level, because it's saying which God is in control of this piece of property. And if Islam maintains control over it, then it creates a situation where in the eyes of the Muslims, they are predominant. They are, they've got the upper hand. And so you have the political, the social, the cultural, and the spiritual battle that is going on for who is dominant on that platform.
Absolutely. And David, I think I went up to the Temple Mount a few years ago, and not only do you get stunning views of the old city and the Mount of Olives and what have you, but the Palestinian police that are up there that guard the Alaska Mosque and and others as well, the Alaska Mosque. What you notice there is that they are very, very concerned about Christians going up there, praying up there. But if you're Jewish, then it's almost impossible to get up there to pray. Isn't this a tragedy today when Jerusalem is such a free and open city?
Yeah, I think it's a sad thing that people don't recognize just how liberal in a way Israel is, in the sense that, freedom of religion, freedom of in terms of even issues around sexuality, people aren't persecuted on that basis. They're allowed to pursue whatever religion they want, not just the three major religions, but actually you've got a Baha'i temple up in Haifa, I think it is, and I think ultimately Jewish people do take that approach to life and to living, which is actually a very allowing people to make their own choices and decisions, whereas actually for Jewish people to not be able to go up onto the Temple Mount and worship, it is a really sad thing. It seems it seems a contradiction when actually Muslims are fully able to pursue their religion in all parts of Israel.
So let's have a look now at how Islam took control of the Temple Mount.
Hi, I'm John Anderson with Cry for Zion. The Temple Mount in Jerusalem is the holiest place in the world for Jews. Jewish history here goes back 4,000 years to the time of Abraham and on to King David, Solomon, Herod, and continues today. But how did Islam get involved with the Temple Mount, a Jewish holy site? When you look at the Temple Mount today, the biggest mistake people make is to think that the Golden Dome is the Al-Aqsa Mosque. That is a monument, not a mosque. The Al-Aqsa Mosque is the Black Dome to the south. Let's back up a couple of thousand years to when the Romans destroyed the Second Jewish Temple in the year 70 CE. The Jews returned as often as possible and repeatedly tried to rebuild the temple, but the Roman Empire, which eventually morphed into a Christian empire, kept a firm hand over Jerusalem, and the Mount remained a ruin. In the year 637, armies from the new religion of Islam in Arabia invaded the whole region and conquered Jerusalem from the Christian Byzantines, subjecting all infidels to the jizya poll tax. The two holiest cities in Islam are, of course, Mecca and Medina. Over time, two Muslim dynasties began fighting for control, one in Medina and one in Damascus. In the year 691, the Caliph in Damascus was still attacking the Christian Byzantines in the west, and even though Jerusalem was ruled by Islam, it was still a mostly Christian and Jewish city and included the most important church in Christendom. Despite the Christians, and to magnify a holy tourist site closer to Damascus, the Caliph built the famous Dome of the Rock over the site of the Jewish temple, not as a mosque, but as a Muslim monument, with anti-Christian slogans on it. In 715, his son followed the same foreign policy. He took a dome from a church in Lebanon and with it built the famous Al-Aqsa Mosque on the southern edge of the mount, facing Mecca. The caliphate soon moved to Baghdad in Iraq, and Jerusalem became relatively unimportant in Islam. It remained a sort of backwater town in Islam until modern times, except for the brief period when the Crusaders took control of Jerusalem, and later when Suleiman the Great rebuilt its walls. Long after Muhammad died, Muslims began tying in Jerusalem into Muslim tradition by connecting it with one mysterious verse in the Quran of Muhammad's journey to the further mosque, the Al-Aqsa. This became a hot debate in Islam, and there are famous Muslim scholars who held that Muhammad's journey was not to Jerusalem. For example, the early Muslim scholar Jafar al-Sadiq responded to the claim that the further mosque was in Jerusalem by saying that even the Mosque of Kufa was superior to the Mosque of Jerusalem. In the 14th century, Ibn Taymiyyah, whose religious opinions are known for influencing such hardliners as al-Qaeda, stated bluntly, "In Jerusalem, there is not a place one calls sacred," and the same holds true for the tombs of Hebron. The night journey is not mentioned in any of the inscriptions on the Dome of the Rock, nor was the Al-Aqsa Mosque built when Muhammad was alive. Nonetheless, this is how Al-Aqsa became the third holiest site in some of Islam, after Mecca and Medina. The Temple Mount remains the #1 holy site in Judaism and all of biblical history. I'm John Anderson with Cry for Zion. For more information, visit cryforzion.com. Click below to subscribe.
Hi, I'm Don Kida with Cry for Zion. Cry for Zion is about the holiest place in the world. It's about justice. It's about freedom. Cry for Zion is about upholding the law and fighting for the rights of people to pray without fear. The Temple Mount in Jerusalem, Mount Zion, is the holiest place on earth for the Jewish people. Here, King Solomon built the first holy temple 3,000 years ago. Here the temple stood for centuries before the Al-Aqsa Mosque became the third holiest site for Muslims, after Mecca and Medina. Today, on the Temple Mount, all non-Muslims are discriminated against and are not even allowed to move their lips in silent prayer, contrary to the law and international human rights. Especially Jews are continuously harassed and abused, forbidden from bringing a Bible, and even their access is severely restricted. Cry for Zion is not about extremism. It's about confronting extremism with justice and to say, wait a minute, let's stop appeasing true extremism, bullying, violence, and hate speech. Cry for Zion is not primarily an organization. It's a movement of Jews and Christians from around the world to see change come to Jerusalem and justice on the Temple Mount. The Temple Mount is really the key Israel issue of our day. Do the Jewish people have a right to this land? If this is true, it's even more true about the Temple Mount. Then why is it that in the heart of the capital of the Jewish state, Jews are abused the most? The only place Jews cannot pray is their own holiest place. Stand with the Jewish people for freedom on the Temple Mount. We can see a change in our generation. Join the movement.
I signed up for the movement because it's imperative and so important that the Jewish people have the right to go up onto the Temple Mount. Robin, you know, you spent 2 years in Jerusalem. It's Jerusalem is a city that I know and love so well, not as well as you. But when it comes down to granting access to the Jewish people to go up and worship on the Temple Mount, to pray on the Temple Mount, to visit the Temple Mount, surely this is essential for democracy and freedom of religion in Jerusalem for that to actually happen.
I totally agree with you, and you know, as David and I both said, it is mind-boggling, really, that the Jewish government cannot enforce the right of Jewish people to go up onto the Temple Mount. Now, I know it's incendiary, okay, but so what? You know, there's the situation regularly happens that the Muslims go there for Friday prayers, they get whipped up by the imams, and then they start chucking stones over the top of the Temple Mount of the Jewish worshippers down in the Kotel Plaza. I mean, this is ridiculous. This should not be allowed, but it has been allowed. And so, you know, successive Israeli governments, successive Jerusalem municipalities have allowed this to happen to the point where, as we've seen in the clip, even Jewish people standing there, not doing anything, are being regularly harassed by Muslims who are up on the Temple Mount. And it beggars belief in this day and age that the government of Israel, you know, I'm sorry to sound critical of it, but it beggars belief that they cannot impose law on that one piece of property and therefore facilitate anybody going up there who wants to go up, no matter what religion they belong to. But we're back to this whole business again of Muslims taking control of something and wanting to keep control of it as a way of saying, we're the boss. You know, you have to do what we tell you to do. And that is a residual effect of what happened after the Six-Day War.
Absolutely. And David, it's astonishing when you actually see the whole area by the Alaska mosque compound, I prefer to call it the Temple Mount, up there, that the fact is that you know, the Palestinians up there will play football quite happily, they will have barbecues up there, and there's a lack of sense of reverence, and particularly in 2014 when the Muslim Brotherhood tried to instigate that Israel was attacking the status quo of the Alaska Mosque. What we saw then from the Dome of the Rock was the fact that you had Palestinian demonstrators almost organising a confrontation, but actually literally throwing fireworks from inside the mosque at Israel. Now, if they are prepared to throw fireworks inside the mosque that could set alight the whole entire mosque, it can't be that sacred, can it?
I mean, I think for me, the whole thing comes down to respect and allowing people to pursue their beliefs and a sense of mutual respect as well. And I guess what's holy to one person isn't holy to another, and different people's ways of expressing their sense of holiness that's fine. But I think for me the important thing is that there's a mutual respect and an ability to say, okay, this is what you believe, and you have the freedom to worship here, and if this is a sacred place for you, okay, we'll respect that to whatever extent we can. But then there needs to be the mutuality about that. That's, I think, for me, is the important thing.
And also, Robin, we're increasingly seeing that the Alaska Mosque is being used as a focal point in order to attack Israel, primarily from the Muslim Brotherhood, who want to make Jerusalem the capital of the Islamic Caliphate, because they see that by controlling Jerusalem, they will then control Israel, and they will then control the West. How important is it that we fight that for, and so that the Temple Mount maintains in the hands of the Jewish people and is not conquered by the Muslim Brotherhood?
Well, I think it's not just the Temple Mount. I think we need to be constantly keeping people aware of the fact that there's a threat to Jerusalem itself, the Temple Mount in the center of it, but to Jerusalem itself. I mean, when I was in Israel, I spent an afternoon with a few friends on a very specialized tour run by a religious Jewish man called Chaim Silberstein, who runs a website called keepjerusalem.org. I'd encourage people to go there, sign up for any information that he sends out. But it was an eye-opening tour. And at one point, he took us up onto the top of Samuel's tomb, and then later on up onto the hilltop where the king of Jordan had tried to build a palace that is just a shell. And Chaim pointed out what he calls the creeping concrete crescent. In other words, there is a building program going on amongst the Arab community all the way from Ramallah right down the eastern side of Jerusalem, right round to Bethlehem, and they are encircling that side of the city with domestic and industrial properties. And most of it is illegally built. Most of it is built on state land and land belonging to prominent Jewish pro-Zionist organizations who many of your viewers, if I named them, would be horrified to know that this is happening. But it's going on, and it actually is a threat to Jewish Jerusalem. So it's the Temple Mount, yes, is the focal point for these two religions, but the whole city is just like a tinderbox, politically and diplomatically. But in the background, this is going on, and they're actually creating facts on the ground through this illegal building program, and it's crazy. And he pointed out that effectively what Israel is permitting is another Gaza Strip all the way down the eastern side of the city of Jerusalem. And he was really concerned as to what the long-term problems will be from allowing this to be created.
Yeah. And David, we see also that the Jewish connection to Jerusalem, the eternal capital of the Jewish people, is being constantly attacked, and it's been happening for the last 2 decades in particular. And now we've seen UN resolutions, we've seen UNESCO in particular say that there is no Jewish connection between Jerusalem and the Jewish people. And surely this is a great injustice that needs to be corrected.
Yeah, and I think, you say going back 2 decades, and in a way this has actually been going on for centuries, because you go all the way back and you've got, when the Romans conquered, they at one point, they obliterated and tried to obliterate all connection between the Jewish people and the land, even, changing the name to Palestine, and that comes from the Romans changing that name to the enemies of the Jewish people at the time. So actually, there have been attempts again and again and again to delegitimize the Jewish people's connection with the land. But it goes back to what we first started talking about, which is that God doesn't just say it's their land, he says it's my land.
Yeah, absolutely.
And he says they're my people, and that connection is an eternal one that God has created. I think that's one of the things that's really important for Christians to understand, for instance, is that connection has not been vaporized somehow and turned into an ethereal, just a spiritual thing, but God still has that practical connection in his heart between the Jewish people and the land. And so the great thing is, though, because God says it's my land, those attempts ultimately are doomed to failure. Even though it's crazy for UNESCO to say that Jerusalem has no connection with the Jewish people in that sense. The Temple Mount has no connection with the Jewish people. To be talking about that in that way, it is clearly nonsense. But God says that kind of nonsense is the stuff that he will defy completely and bring to nothing in the end.
Absolutely. So let's have a look now at Israel's ambassador in the United Nations defending Jerusalem and proving the connection between the Jewish people and their eternal city, Jerusalem.
Thank you, Mr. President. It is shameful for the United Nations that I must stand before you today. It is shameful that this meeting is even taking place. Jerusalem is the holiest place on earth for the Jewish people. It is the capital of the state of Israel, period. It is a fact that simply cannot be disputed. King David declared Jerusalem the city of the Jewish people 3,000 years ago. The Jewish Bible mentions Jerusalem 660 times. Our prayers recall Jerusalem's holy name over and over again. As our Prime Minister, the first Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion, said, and I quote, "Jerusalem is an inseparable part of the history of Israel, of the faith of Israel." I am holding an original coin. It's from 67 AD. It says in Hebrew, and I quote, "Freedom of Zion." Look in the envelope in front of you. You will see you have a replica of the coin. It is clear evidence from the time of our Second Temple. It proves the ancient connections of Jews to Jerusalem. Our bond to Jerusalem is unbreakable. No UNESCO declaration, no empty speeches, no General Assembly resolution will ever drive us from Jerusalem.
And that was a great speech there by Israel's ambassador to the United Nations, countering the lies and the mistruths put out by UNESCO and certainly the Islamic states who want to change the status of Jerusalem. Robin, we know there's a huge spiritual battle as well as a political battle that's being waged over the city of Jerusalem. You know, Israel has celebrated her 70th anniversary as a nation reborn. We're also celebrating the 51st anniversary of the liberation and unification of Jerusalem. And particularly in light of President Trump's decision to recognise Israeli sovereignty over Jerusalem and to move the US Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. What impact can this have and what role can Christians play in defending the eternal city?
Well, as far as the impact is concerned, I mean, I think time will tell on that, but I believe that the United States moving of the embassy to Talpiot, which is where it's going to be located, may be a trigger point for others who have been afraid to do it. And we know there are 3 or 4 nations who have openly said that they're considering doing it. So that's good. And maybe that would create a domino effect and others will return. But the other side to this debate is the fact that there are many key nations, and sadly, including our own, the United Kingdom, who still actually refuse to acknowledge Jerusalem, and that's all of Jerusalem, as Israel's capital city. So I think the pressure is on those who love Israel and the Jewish people to seek to try as best as we can to try and apply pressure to our own government to follow suit. And the only way to do that is through your local MP. So in other words, write to your local MP and ask them, are they prepared to stand up in Parliament and ask that the Foreign and Commonwealth Office reconsider relocating the British Embassy from the seafront in Tel Aviv back to Jerusalem, or upgrading the status of the consulate that's in Sheikh Jarrah to a full embassy status. Yes, we can pray. And I'm not saying don't do that. I'm not downplaying that because, as David said earlier on, this is totally irrational. So you can only put it down to the fact that we're in the midst of a spiritual conflict. But I have to, as I've said many times in this program before, praying is not enough. And that's a very Jewish thing. You need to be doing something. And the doing something is actually putting pressure on our parliamentary representatives to put pressure on the government to change its mind.
Absolutely. And David, talking about prayer, the Bible commands us to pray for the peace of Jerusalem every day. How significant is that? We should do that.
I think it's time and again God commands us to do that. Commands us to pray, and also I think to pray for the Jewish people as well. But I think you were talking about Christians and what can Christians do, and I think. That actually it starts with an understanding of who Jesus is. That's, So I think, so I wrote the book, it's called The Jewish Jesus, but actually the subtitle is Reconnecting with the Truth about Jesus, Israel and the Church. And I think for Christians actually, part of the reason they don't pray for Jerusalem, part of the reason they're not actually doing these things that we're talking about is because they don't have an accurate picture of Jesus as a Jewish man. Yeah. And what I find is when you restore that lens, then you begin to understand who Jesus really is as a Jewish rabbi, as a teacher. Yes, he's universal, but he's specific. And that's what Christians struggle with, because everything has become universal. And so in doing that, they rob Jesus of his actual context, his culture. And that has massive connection with what we're talking about today. Because when you see Jesus as a Jewish man, you have to ask yourself, how does he actually then feel about the Jewish people? And what about all this stuff about Jerusalem and Israel? Is that more than just history? Because in reality, when you look at the New Testament as well, what we call the New Testament, you see there's all these scriptures that are also pointing towards actually God is still doing something with Jerusalem. God still wants us to be praying for Jerusalem. God is still heading to Jerusalem. There is still something that's going to happen and come to pass. And so I think for Christians, it's important to pray for Jerusalem, but it's more important to pray with understanding, an understanding of God's heart. And that can only come when we take off the layers of tradition and we allow ourselves to experience the Jewishness of Jesus that leads us to understand God's heart for the Jewish people in Israel. As the prophet Zechariah says, he who touches you touches the apple of my eye, God's eye, the pupil. And that causes us to rethink our position on all of these things and gives us not just, that command to pray, because it's hard to do something if you don't have an accurate understanding. Absolutely. You need the why as well. You need a belief change that comes before the action. And so I think, for me, what's really important is that Christians not only pray for Jerusalem, but they pray with understanding, that they get God's heart. Because it is a spiritual thing. It's not something you can work out in your mind. It is, the Bible talks about it as a mystery. And mysteries of God, they're not supposed to be hidden. They're supposed to be revealed to us. But we need the Holy Spirit to show us the truth of God's heart. And that's what I believe is important. That's when I think, we talked about the fullness of the Gentiles. Part of that is not just numbers. It's about carrying this heart for the Jewish people, carrying that understanding of God's purposes for Israel and for Jerusalem.
And if I can just come in here, Simon, and say that I only read David's book, The Jewish Jesus, last summer. And I have to say, from my perspective as someone who's been connected with these sort of things for 10, 12 years, it is one of the best books I have ever read as an introduction to the whole concept of what David has been talking about. So if your viewers want to read a good book themselves, or more importantly, if they've got friends who are open to these things and want a good primer, then David's book, The Jewish Jesus, is an excellent way to start.
Excellent. I have to ask you, Robin, if we care about what God cares about, then we have to care about Jerusalem, don't we? How important is it that we keep Jerusalem in our prayers every day?
Well, if we say that we care about God's heart, and if as Christians with an understanding of the Jewish Jesus and the Jewish people, if that's where we're coming from, then we need to get to grips with what God says about Jerusalem, about the land, about the Jewish people. And as David has said, use that as the foundation of our praying, but our action as well. We need to be grounded in what the Word of God says, not preachers, no disrespect, not politicians or diplomats. We take our lead from what God says himself so clearly and unequivocally in his word. And much of the problem in the church over this issue is the fact that we have veered away from taking the Word of God at face value and not following it and doing what God says.
Absolutely. Within 30 seconds, David, why defend Jerusalem, to sum up?
I think to sum up, because just as Robin was saying then, you know, this is again and again the heart of God. Absolutely. God has placed so much treasure in that place. And if you like, it's almost like a test for mankind. Mm-hmm. That God says, this one thing is mine. So love it, respect it, and keep it in your hearts.
David, Robin, thank you so much for being my guests on today's Middle East Report.
Thank you, Simon.
Thank you.
And I want to thank you for watching today's programme. We all have a duty not only to pray for the peace of Jerusalem, but also to defend Israel's covenant city. And we can do that by proclaiming the truth of Israel's situation. And only under Israeli sovereignty will Jerusalem flourish, as we're seeing Jerusalem flourish today. So keep Jerusalem in your prayers. And we leave you with this beautiful song that looks at the beauty of Jerusalem, the city of God, at night. Good.